Welcome to this EDU Core Research Grants Management webinar as we head toward the PI meeting that's coming up for ECR at the end of this month. We thought it would be nice to do a session like this for new awardees, as well as maybe more experienced PIs, just in terms of grants management. We will try to cover some high-level broader issues around grants management. If you have very specific questions about your award, we encourage you to reach out to your program officer, either at the PI meeting or over email. Okay, so I'm Rob Ochsendorf, one of the program directors here in the EDU Core Research program, and I am joined by one of my colleagues. Go ahead, Dawn.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. I'm Dawn Rickey. I'm currently the co-lead program director for the EDU Core Research program and the lead program director for building capacity in STEM education research.
Fantastic. So Dawn and I will sort of take turns today. These are the topics that we will cover. We have prepared content for about half of the time, and then we hope to leave quite a bit of time for questions at the end. We'll talk about progress reports, changes, notifications and requests, attention to acknowledgement, research security, etc. And then we will leave time for some Q&A. First, though, we would like to get to know our audience a little bit. And so a first poll. And so can we launch this first poll? There we go. Which of these topics do you most want to hear about? Go ahead and take a minute to answer. Here we go. Fantastic. So it seems like, well, we'll share the results here in a second, but well, no, it's a real-time poll, so everybody can see the results, I guess. Yeah, Dawn, can you see it? Yeah, okay. Great, so here you can get a sense. The first three topics that we will address seem to be of most interest, and fantastic. I know that our colleagues at AIR did a little bit of survey of the community to try to understand needs, and so this is fantastic. Okay. And I think we had another poll that we were going to launch now as well, and related to a question about, is this your first NSF grant? Trying to get a sense of audience. And some of you in attendance may not be grantees, and that's okay too. Almost an exactly 2/3, 1/3 split between first-time NSF grant and not first-time NSF grant. Okay, good on this. Fantastic. That's helpful to us to know where we're headed. Okay, great. A little bit about one of the first topics here, which you all wanted to hear about, which is working with your program director. And so we recommend that you reach out early and often post-award. We like to hear about positive developments, success stories. Maybe you were able to successfully recruit and hire a great new postdoc or a new doctoral student to the project. Something like that. It's always nice to hear. We also are happy to engage on issues or questions that arise. It almost never goes exactly how you wrote it up in the proposal. And so when there are changes, you know, and you think that it would be good to let us know, then that's fine. Some budget changes will require NSF approval, many will not. Common issues that come up that require NSF approval would be like change of key personnel, right? So if you have a significant reduction in effort by one or more people on the project, that's a clear example where you would want to reach out. Or if somebody is leaving the project completely, that's something that you would need to get approved. We often have annual report questions, which we hope to address today. If you are adding international travel that wasn't in your original proposal, that is like something that does need approval, program officer sign off. If you are moving funds from participant support costs, that is something that needs official approval from NSF. And then change of dates. Change of dates is another area where you know, you do need to let us know if you're adding 12 months or another 12 months, and there's a part of the webinar that gets into that issue as well. And so we'll cover that in a little bit more detail. So those are kind of the main things. Key points of interaction will often be around the annual report. So when the annual report gets submitted, program officer will review. If there are questions, that's sometimes an obvious point of engagement. Also, PI meetings, another opportunity for engagement. I know we haven't been having in-person PI meetings, but we are about to, and that's a great time to interact with your program director. Okay, turn it over to Dawn on progress reporting.
Okay, yes, so we'll talk a bit about progress reporting. As Rob mentioned, this is one of the main ways that you communicate with us about how your project is going. So first of all, we found out before that we have a lot of folks where this is their first NSF project. So we also wanted to know, have you previously written and submitted an NSF annual report? So we'll launch a poll on that so you can let us know. Okay, looks like about a 60-40 split, with about 60% having previously submitted an annual report and 40% not. Okay, thanks for that. That helps in terms of thinking about what to talk about a bit here. So again, we welcome you to, as Rob said, drop us an email, talk to us at a PI meeting, give us a call. But one of the main ways that we learn about how your project is going is through reporting. And you have a report for your award that is due for each project year. So you have an annual report for each year, and then the final report is actually the last project report with some differences, but the content of those are essentially the same. None of them are cumulative, as we'll mention later. And then if something really interesting happens, or perhaps if there are issues, you can also optionally submit an interim report to let us know about things like that. And then there's also a project outcomes report, and that is required. It's different than the annual and final project reports, and there's only one of them that comes at the end of the project. And the idea behind the project outcomes report is to report to the public on mainly the outcomes of the project. So, the taxpayer funding supported your award, and this is the public reporting aspect of it. Program directors do not have to review the project outcome report. So obviously we can view it just like the rest of the public, but it's not one that we review like the annual and final reports. In terms of submission, you submit all of these kinds of reports through research.gov, and PIs or co-PIs can prepare and submit those reports. Your sponsored research office is not involved in the submission, but can review the reports that you submit. Okay. So a little bit more about annual reports. Again, this is a main way of you letting us know what happened during a particular project year. And one of the things that can be confusing about both annual and final reports is when they're due and when they're overdue. So we'll talk a bit about that. So an annual report is due no later than 90 days before the end of the current reporting budget period. So this is not quite the same as, for example, if you're teaching and you give your students a due date, right, where there's one point in time where before that time it's it's due, and after it's overdue, because here you actually have a time period of 90 days, which is considered the due period. And then during that due period, you actually need to submit the report, and the program director needs to approve the report during that period in order for the project not to become overdue. And if both of those things don't happen during that time, and the 90 days elapses, then the report will be overdue. So it's important to try to submit the report early on during that 90-day due period, because the program director, again, needs to review it. They may return it to you for some revisions and ultimately need to approve it within that time period. And we have a diagram coming up to maybe help clarify the timing on that as well. But a couple of other points about annual reports. If they do become overdue, then there are some consequences to that. So, for example, we cannot recommend new awards if a PI or co-PI associated with the award that's potentially going to be recommended has an overdue report. In addition, things like no-cost extensions can be delayed. We can't process that if there's an overdue report. And if you have the type of grant, which is called a continuing grant, where you don't get all the funding immediately upon award, and you have some increments that are released later, the increments are released upon the approval of particular reports. So it's important to have your annual reports approved on time for all of those reasons. So of course, allow plenty of time so that you think about the content of those reports and write us a thorough report, and then give the program director enough time to review, possibly return and approve before that 90-day period is up. And so here is the little diagram that I mentioned that may help to visualize how these due dates work. So let's say that you have a new award and the start date of the award is June 1st, 2024. That would mean that your first project year and reporting period is from June 1st, 2024 through May 31st, 2025. Now, the annual report for your first year then is going to be due starting on March 1st, okay? You have that 90-day period through May 31st, which is considered the due period. And then if the report is not both submitted and approved before June 1st, it will become overdue on June 1st. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of thinking about it. I know it's an unusual way to think about when things are due and overdue.
Yeah, there's a number of, go back one slide, Don. There's a number of questions in the chat, and I think this should help clarify for folks. It starts being due on March 1st, and then it's overdue in June. And so there are a number of questions in the Q&A and chat, and so hopefully this is helpful to folks. And yes, it means that this first reporting period is less than 12 months usually, and that's okay, right?
Right, that's right. And that's a good point as well. So, your first report will report on from the beginning of your award through whenever you submit that first report. And then the next annual report will not be cumulative. It will report on what is new since the last report that you submitted. And that's true for all of the reports, including the final report. Nothing is cumulative there. Thanks, Rob. Okay. In terms of the structure and content of annual reports, I think we're going to have a link to the report template for you in the chat. Great, thank you, Joni. So you'll see there, and you will have seen if you've submitted an annual report before, that there are 5 main sections that you're asked to fill out. And you'll note in the instructions that not all of them are required for you to add information to, but we really like you. It's really helpful to us if you can be fairly complete in terms of the sections that are relevant to your annual report. So that first section about accomplishments, that's really the meat of the annual report. And you'll be asked about your activities during the reporting period. So what did your project team do during the reporting period? What were the main activities? What were the specific objectives for that reporting period? And then what were the significant results of your research that you can report? And if it's a first year, maybe you won't have, so that's an example of where maybe you wouldn't have something to fill in a particular box. And also any key outcomes and achievements. So it's not only research results, but also outcomes that may be related to broader impacts, for example, or maybe related to things going on with the personnel in terms of like who is working on various things and what they've achieved. There's also in that section a request for information about opportunities that the project team has had for training and development. That may be particularly salient for the building capacity in STEM education research projects. It asks about what dissemination activities you've engaged in, and also what you plan to do in the next reporting period. So that's really where we get to understand what's been going on during the project year. The next section is a product section, and that is where you report on publications, presentations, and you may want to upload as attachments any publications, PDFs of posters, and things like that, so we can see that. As a side note also, in the text boxes, we really want you to fill in the relevant information there. So don't write your whole report, let's say, as a PDF and attach it. Really reserve the attachment area for graphics that you may want to refer to, and also, publications, evaluation reports, or reports from the advisory board are another thing that you may want to upload as attachments. The next section is participants and organizations. So that's who has participated in your project during the reporting year, and particularly you're required to report on people who have worked at least 1 person month on the project that year. And that section also asks about organizations that have collaborated with you during the project year. Next up is the impacts section. And so there you see in the template, there are lots of different questions about types of impacts that are potentially relevant for your project. So, how has the project impacted the discipline? That's the main discipline relevant to the project, or other disciplines, impacts related to human resources, to benefits to society, or broader impacts. So think about what the really important impacts of your project have been for that year, and let us know about those. And then finally, the changes and problems section. And a lot of times we see this as being blank, but we really want to know about any changes that have occurred and any problems. We want your projects to be successful. We want to be able to help you if we can. And we just want to be aware of what's going on with your project. So be sure to let us know about any changes, any problems that have come up. I mean, it would be really rare for a project to never have any issues or to to progress exactly how the proposal suggested. So definitely keep us apprised of those types of things so we can communicate with you about them. All right. And just in terms of some tips about annual project reports, again, report on each specific year, not a cumulative report for each report, so specific to the reporting period. I mentioned fill them in as completely as possible and to share changes and problems. So I think all of these things have been mentioned previously. Okay. And then in terms of the final report and project outcomes report, those both come at the end of the project. And in fact, right up front, I'll say, if you have not finished the scope of your project, you may not want to be submitting the final report and project outcomes report right away, because that will signify, if you submit those, that you consider your project finished, you consider the scope to be complete. So if it's possible that you may want to request something like a no-cost extension, then you want to hold off on submitting a final report or a project outcomes report until you have requested that or looked into the possibility for something like a no-cost extension. Aside from that, though, the content of the final report is essentially the same as an annual report. Again, it's not cumulative and just reports on that final year or the time since your last report. There is a difference in the due date, though, for final reports. So final reports, you have 120 days after the end date of an award. So that 120 days after the end date is now the due period for the final report. And the report will not become overdue unless the report is not both submitted and approved before the end of that 120 days. And the due date for the project outcomes report is similar. Now, what it, again, is a project outcomes report? That is the public-facing report where you really let the public know about what your project has accomplished. And Joni has put an example of a project outcomes report in the chat, the link in the chat. Project outcomes report is not approved by program directors, and program directors, of course, can view it just like the rest of the members of the public on the NSF website. And again, we have a schematic here to show the due dates for the final project reports and project outcome reports. So if you have a grant whose end date is May 31st, 2025, then that last year of reporting for the final report would be from June 1st, 2024 to May 31st, 2025. If in fact, you submit your final project report and outcomes report, the project ends, and then you have 120 days until, in this case, October 1st, 2025, to have that report submitted and approved. And again, you want to not submit it just before October 1st, 2025. You want to give us, we like to have at least a month or two before that so that we can review it, potentially return it if necessary, and ultimately approve that report before it becomes overdue. Okay. All right, and then just a word about, it says here rejection, but what we really say is that sometimes we need to return a report. So, and that's actually the button we click in the system. It's not a reject button. So don't feel rejected or dejected if a project report comes back to you and we ask for some sort of a revision. I would say most typically project reports may be returned to you if we feel like there's some information missing there that we really want to see in the report. Sometimes it happens when you when a PI attaches a publication to a report, that's great. But then they might not actually give us a summary in the text about what the findings were. And so we may send it back and say, yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that research article, but please give me a summary here in the findings section to tell me what, summary of what that article says. And so, don't allow that to be upsetting. If a report gets returned to you, just address the issues that we've asked you to and submit it again. So then hopefully we can approve it fairly quickly after that. Also, again, as we've been saying, the report, if it's past the due period and it's overdue when we return it to you, it's going to stay overdue until it's actually approved by a program director. All right. So Rob, do we have more questions about reports?
Thank you, Don. There's been like we've had some back and forth on like continuing grants versus standard grants, and it's relevant here with respect to reports because the approval of your annual report is tied to the release of your next increment if you have a continuing grant. And in the chat, I was trying to explain a little bit of the difference between continuing and standard grants. In your original award letter, it will say it is clear if you're receiving all the funds now or if there are still out-year funds to be released. That will be in your original award letter, right? And so read that award letter closely so you know exactly which kind of grant structure you have. Is this a standard grant with all of the funds available to the institution for drawdown on day one, or is it a continuing grant whereby subsequent amounts of money are released by NSF down the road? And those are tied to the approval of the annual report. I mean, in fact, like when Don and I click those buttons to approve those annual reports, the system will ask us, are you ready to release the funds, for the next increment? And we have to click yes. And so that's how specifically it is tied to the approval of your annual report. So that was one thing that was going on. There's a couple other things, but I think we're doing pretty well on the questions. I think in terms of personnel who've worked on the project, I think if they've worked on the project and it's a relevant contribution, I think yes, list them. Especially if they're being paid by the project. If they're not being paid by the project, then I don't think it's necessary to list them. So there's a question about what are our expectations around communicating major accomplishments in advance of the annual report. Every program officer is a little bit different. If you have a publication accepted to a journal and you have those preprints available or the final copy available, I love to see that in my inbox just as a general courtesy. Like, that's exciting. I think that's relevant to share with the program officer, but then yes, you can also attach it to the annual report. And so, most things probably don't require, no, we can usually wait until the annual report to hear how things are going. I don't know if you have anything to add on that point, Don, but I think the major things are, especially good news we like to hear. If it's especially bad news, like, oh, I lost one of my key people on the project, they're leaving, or I was working with these 3 school districts, now I'm only down to 1 school district. Like, I think those are kinds of things that we would like to know about sooner rather than later.
Yes, I agree. Thanks.
Okay. Great. And I think we're going to try and press on and get through these last few slides. So here are some changes. There's some questions in the chat about, when do we reach out? The no-cost extensions are quite common. It's to provide the team additional time beyond the project end date to assure adequate completion of the original scope of work. The first 12-month extension is called the grantee approved extension. Please submit that at least 10 calendar days, probably more. You're get it in. If it comes in a couple months before the end date, then that's fine. Note that as a condition of your award, the institution is entitled to that first 12-month extension, right? It comes to Don and I, we click reviewed, meaning that we just kind of acknowledge that the dates have been changed. That's fine. Work with your sponsored programs officer to make sure that that comes in. The next 12-month extension is NSF approved, right? And so therefore we ask a little bit more time and a little bit more heads up. This has been common with COVID and the pandemic to have, the 12 months and then another 12 months to finish the original scope of work. I like to ask for a spend down plan. Like if you're asking for another 12 months and I'm seeing a large available balance of funds, I like to see a plan to get that down to 0 by the end of the second no-cost extension. And maybe also by the end of the first, depending on where the project is and what the goals are and so forth, and how much money remains and what kinds of problems they have encountered. All of this depends on the project and the budget and so forth. In this second extension, you will have to explain a little bit more in terms of the money remaining and your plans for their use. Okay, here are some other kinds of things that you need to reach out to us about. And these are official kind of notifications and requests. If there's a change in PI, somebody's leaving an institution, leaving the project, or if somebody's significantly reducing their time and effort on the project, we need to know about that. Changes in objective or scope, those are pretty significant. Methods, procedures. If there have been significant changes, delays, or events, we would need to know about that, certainly in the annual report. And that's a good place to notify. If you are adding a new subaward that wasn't in the original budget, which was not reviewed by NSF, you need to get approval for that, right? So sometimes it happens that maybe a PI changes institution, but they want to remain on the project. And so then you need a new subaward to that new institution. That's an example where you need an NSF approval for that new subaward. If you are adding a postdoc that was not in the original budget, we need a postdoc mentoring plan, and that needs to be documented. And so you have to reach out to NSF program officer on that. Here's a slide on acknowledgements. This is pretty standard. We ask that you include this language, acknowledgement of support, as well as the disclaimer. If you have project websites and things, we ask that you look at this logos website and make sure that you're using the current logos, which Joni just dropped into the chat. Thank you, Joni. There's been some updates to NSF branding, and so you just want to make sure that you visit that site and make sure that you're using current logos and that sort of thing. A note about research integrity, research security. All projects require a data management plan, and so part of the review of your proposal has to do with how you're handling the data, how it's being stored, as well as attention to IRB issues. That's another thing that hasn't really been addressed. Usually your IRB, this is your human subjects protocols, are reviewed annually by your institution. And we ask that you attach those to your annual report or email them to your program officer when that new IRB comes in. You know that prior to making the award, NSF requires having some documentation related to IRB on file before we will release the funds. Okay, so there's a question about, can a PI take a grant with them to another institution? Yeah, but those are, I mean, okay. Career awards are a little bit different. Career awards are essentially required to be tied to the individual. So when a career award is made, the institution knows that if that PI leaves, that those funds go with the PI, provided they go to another domestic institution, and that can all be worked out. If it's not a career award, then it's up to the two institutions to work that out. Generally speaking, institutions play nice, and if Dr. Google has received a new job at XYZ State University, that her home institution will play nice and negotiate some what we call a grant transfer. And a grant transfer is a topic for a whole other webinar, but reach out to your program officer if you have to go through a grant transfer. Most of the time, they work out fine. The institutions behave well and they play nice together, and a certain amount of funds are moved to the new institution where the new PI, or where the PI is taking a new job. Hope that's helpful. I think Don kind of answered that in the chat. Okay. Sometimes there are international collaborations that NSF just needs to be aware of. If you are a researcher who is also supported by some international entity or involves data collection, new data collection that maybe wasn't part of the peer review process, you need to make sure that NSF is aware. And there's been actually, you know, you can Google that if you want to see about researchers who don't disclose international support to the feds, and that can create problems. So just make sure that you are upfront. It has to do with protecting from foreign influence. But generally speaking, I think, you know, in the event that there are collaborations, international collaborations, usually it's fine. We just have to be made aware. Okay. A bit about reviewing. We, you know, if any of you have served on panel before for us, you know that it is super helpful to you to understand our merit review process, common pitfalls, strategies and tips for writing strong proposals. You get to meet peers, you get to interact with NSF program officers, you get to understand and see sort of where the field is headed in certain directions. We ask that you let your program officer know. You can also email your CV to the program email alias with a 2 or 3 page CV. And if your areas of expertise align with our needs, then somebody may reach out to you. Great, we're coming down to the end. Okay, sorry, project budget. Generally speaking, these are discretionary grants, and you know, for small changes to budget, that's that's up to the awardees, right? So you want to move a little bit of money from one budget category to another as the PI, sort of that's your call. If your institution is giving you a hard time and they're asking for NSF approval for that, you can email your program officer. But for the most part, I think the threshold is something like under 20% of the total overall budget amount. Then you can move those dates. We've gone over start dates and we've gone over no cost extensions. So Those are the main items there. Here is a link to the PAP, what we call the PAP-G, NSF Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide. A new one is released every year. And Joni has just dropped into the chat the link to the current PAP-G for, I think it's NSF 24-1. And it's, if you have grant management related questions, you can open up that PDF, do a quick word search for whatever issue you're looking for. And generally speaking, it's covered in the PAP-G, and that can be quite helpful as a first step before you reach out to your program officer. What does the PAP-G say about this issue? We have a Q&A session lined up now with the remaining time. We've been answering a lot of questions. We also have a survey that we are asking you to respond to with respect to this particular event. And so I'll note that survey there, and Joni just dropped it into the chat. And I think we can open the floor for questions, and David, bring you in a little bit, maybe to moderate. If there's some things that we didn't touch on that we can circle back, please let us know.
Sure, yeah, it's been a very active chat, both in the Q&A and the chat box as well. Try to get to as many questions. Many of them have already been answered in the chat, but in those cases, we might also want to get to it verbally as well, just so that we kind of surface it. I'll start with questions that we haven't yet answered in the chat. There was two about working with program officers on the annual reports, and there's kind of two different scenarios. So one question was, should we reach out to the program officer when working on the report in order to make sure we're including the correct content, or just expect to receive feedback after we submit it? So that's kind of before the submission, potentially working with your program officer. And then there was a second question on after having submitted the report. If my report is overdue and waiting on program officer approval, should I just wait patiently, or to reach out to see if the program officer needs anything? In other words, the person is asking, is it annoying to reach out in those situations? So what would you recommend in those two different situations on working with a program officer?
Yeah, on the first one, I generally don't hear from people as they're writing their report. I don't know what your experience has been, Don. But yeah, I think the feedback usually comes after. And sometimes local resources at your institution can be helpful in putting together the annual report or talking to colleagues. Don, do you have any other thoughts on that one?
Occasionally I'll get a question about something specific in the report, and that's fine. If you have a question about something, feel free to reach out. But yeah, typically I don't hear from many people beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, stick to what you said you would do in your proposal and report out on those objectives, and you should be fine. Let us know about major things. What was the second part, David? Oh, if it's not approved. This is, if it gets to be weeks and starts to push beyond a month, and especially if it's starting to affect other award actions, yes, reach out. I think it's not annoying. It's our job to review these. And so I don't know, Don, if you have other thoughts on that.
Yes, I think if you have a question about it, go ahead and check in. Sometimes things can happen. For example, if you may know we have a lot of rotating program directors, and it occasionally happens if a rotating program director is managing your award, they leave and maybe the award hasn't been reassigned to someone else. That could be a cause for delay. So yeah, I think checking in is a fine idea.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. We also got some questions about situations that require prior NSF approval. So I'll sort of bucket those together and maybe chunk it out into a few different questions. Some questions that were on kind of the smaller end. There's two of, what if the PI is taking a sabbatical for one semester, but will come back at the end of this semester? Does that need approval? And do you need approval to move summer funding to a course release or vice versa? Do either of those require prior approval?
Go ahead, Don.
Can you give it to me one more time?
Sabbatical.
Sure. Yeah.
One semester sabbatical.
Yeah. So I think what I'm understanding in this case is they're just shifting the amount of their effort within the course of a grant year. So they're not taking, say, a sabbatical for the full year, but they're taking a sabbatical for one semester, and they're going to come back at the end of the semester. And relatedly, there is moving summer funding to a course release. So it's kind of the allocation of a PI's effort within the course of a grant year.
Right. Typically, for the part about the budget reallocation, typically that's not something that you need approval for. In terms of a PI going away on sabbatical, I think that's something I would like to know. I'm not sure that it falls under something that's required for you to report, but that would be something I would sort of want to know. So it'd be great if you could check in and let us know what's going on and things like that happen.
Yep.
And in a similar vein, is it allowable to request person effort for a PI beyond the 2-month limit if the expected workload is higher than anticipated? Is that something to ask the PO about, or does it fall under normal rebudgeting?
If it's at time of award, if it's above 2 months, then that requires some extra justification on your part, and maybe you might get a question or two on that. If you're rebudgeting during the award period to bump your effort above 2 months, yeah, I mean, I haven't had that happen as often. I don't know, probably would want to let us know about that, especially if it's across all of your NSF projects.
Yeah, I believe it's allowed if your institution allows it.
Yeah.
But again, we like to be informed on what's going on.
Yeah.
All right, and the last question I have for now under that bucket of prior approval is about participant support. So the question is that's separate from research participants, is that correct? And besides the REU, what constitutes participant support? And this was in the context of that there often is that there is prior NSF approval needed when moving between budget items for participant support.
Yeah, this is kind of somewhat common, especially related to the pandemic, when maybe you were budgeting to have lots of teachers be on site for something, and now they're not. And so you have cost savings related to that. And so now you have a bunch of money sitting in participant support that you need to move into some other category. And so usually it's, in my experience, it's teachers that are being supported under participant support costs. And so this is an NSF rule that is in place that is meant to, in some ways, kind of protect these individuals who are meant to be supported on the project. And so when you're moving money out of that category, that's when your institution will say, hey, that we can do some budget changes, but that one is different, and that one requires NSF approval. And that's a specific request that we have to sign off on.
Right, and those folks that are being compensated under participant support, they're being trained for something. So it's not research subjects. It's folks like teachers that Rob mentioned, could also be faculty members participating in a workshop or something like that. So yeah.
Now I'm going to put in the chat a link to the part of the PAPPG that defines participant support as well.
Thank you.
So, all right, and then we recently got just 2 questions, kind of about more generally working with program officer. So we had one that was asking, do the program officers want us to email or talk to them? I think I've heard that they are very busy people. And then we had another question saying, I've emailed my program officer several times, haven't heard back. I have some questions about change in status of a PI, and I'm wondering if I should reach out again.
Yeah, I mean, look, Don mentioned our rotating program officers, but even some of our permanent program officers get swamped sometimes. And so, yeah, if you're not getting a response, that's unfortunate. And, one way is to reach out to a program officer, maybe that another program officer, or the email alias for the program would be another way. Maybe Joni or David, you could drop that email alias into the chat for ECR. That's another way you'll reach the leads of the ECR program that way. That's unfortunate. If you're not getting a response on an important issue, we need to do better, and somebody will help you get that answer.
Yeah, I'll definitely drop that email in. Let me tee up another question before. Let's see. So I had a couple that were on the content of the annual report. So kind of on a level of detail. So there's one very specific question that was, how much detail would be requested of any professional development provided, dates and participants or materials? So that's kind of a very specific question about one specific section in the annual report, but also maybe more generally, how should people think about the level of detail? And maybe another way to put it, in the annual reports that you review, are there some things that you wish there was more detail on? Are there other cases where PI has provided way more detail and they might have spent more time? How should they be thinking about the level of detail and time and effort that goes into preparing the annual reports?
Yeah, I always find it tricky to kind of define level of detail, right? So I don't know. I guess the advice I would give is to, try to think about your audience being your program director, someone who in most cases is probably familiar with your project from previous years. In some cases, you may have someone new, but to give us a sense of what's going on, in the context that, we have the background usually of your proposal, and yeah, I don't know, Rob, if you do a better job, it's just hard for me to articulate about level of detail, I think.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add. I mean, I think, it doesn't need to be 100 pages, but it shouldn't be 2 pages. You're reporting out on a significant federal investment here with respect to the goals and objectives that you laid out in the proposal. Yeah.
Another question on the content of the report, on what are some example changes or problems to report? So that's kind of a general question. And then we also got one more specific question in that same theme, sort of saying if there's some unexpected emergent realizations that led some people that are working on the project to pursue a side project that might not have been exactly within the original proposal, but still was kind of inspired by it, should those products go in the annual reports? So extra products, which actually sounds like kind of a good thing, but then also on the side of when there are those changes and problems, and what are some examples of those?
Some of the most common things. If there's a delay in expenditures or problems have been encountered and you've not discussed it, and you say there's not a delay in expenditures, because there's a specific question that says, is there a delay in expenditures? I can see the drawdowns and see if the project has been drawing down. That is like one of the top reasons for me to return a report. Sometimes the projects don't include the website URL. You fail to mention that the advisory board convened, if you have an advisory board. If you do not attend to the feedback in the prior year's report, like you make the same mistakes again, then I'll return the report. And those are a few of the reasons that I will return reports. The second question, too. Don?
On that, and similarly for me, it's usually something that I feel like is missing that I really want to have in the report is a reason that I would return it. And in terms of the other question about if there's a side project, should you report on that? Certainly, if funds from the award are being used for the side project, absolutely, you should be reporting on all activities that the funding for the project is being used for. If not, I mean, I guess probably not. If the funds, I mean, you could, I guess. It wouldn't be required if the funds for the project are not being used.
All right, we're coming up on 2 minutes, so maybe there's just a couple more, recognizing there might have been a few stray questions that we didn't get to answer. If we haven't gotten to answer your question, you're coming to the ECR PI meeting, definitely reach out to a program officer or follow up by email, as Rob noted earlier on. But let's see if we can hammer out kind of a couple more before we officially close for today. Another question on participant support. I understand that you need prior approval to move cost from participant support to elsewhere, but can you move money into participant support cost without prior approval if it was not budgeted for initially?
Yes.
Very easy. All right. Well, since we are 1 minute to the hour, I think we can close early, especially if people are running to another meeting and need a little transition time. Like Joni mentioned in the chat, we have been recording this webinar. We will send out the link to the webinar. And thank you so much for joining and being a very engaged audience. Lots of great questions in the chat and Q&A. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Come and say
Thank
hello
you
to
all.
us at the PI meeting.
Yes, looking forward to seeing you all in a few weeks. Thank you.
Take care.